Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Our webinar topic today is DevSecOps. We're going to go through a number of items touching on this very important aspect of your development area. We're going to get started in just a second or two. I just want to ask you or remind you, you'll see the question box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Please feel free to type your questions at any time during the presentation. We will get to them either after you type them or certainly at the end of the presentation. I really appreciate everybody joining us today. I know these are difficult times and everybody's very busy. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Steve Racing, CEO of ASMGI. Thanks, Steve, and take it away.
Great, thank you, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for being on. Steve Racing here from ASMGI, and with me today is Frank Yako, our CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives. Frank, thanks for being on today as well.
Hi, Steve. Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a great topic today, DevSecOps. I know, there's been a lot of talk. DevOps has been around for a long time, and, DevSecOps is kind of an evolution of that. So I'm really excited to be talking about this specifically, and I think we have a great program for you. So that said, our agenda for the day is, I want to make sure that we answer for everybody on the call, what's it mean to move to the left? The title of the event obviously is, are you moving to the left? And I want to answer that question directly, so we'll do that. We'll talk about some intros and objectives and things like that, and then move into what's the purpose of DevOps and what problem is it solving and those kind of things. And then just really what's the difference, right? What's the difference between DevSecOps and DevOps? And then we'll wrap it up with, how you actually do this and what are the things that you need to consider and stay away from and various different things. And obviously, as Paul mentioned, please, as interactive as we can keep this, the better. And ask any questions as they come up. We'll try to get to them, and hopefully we can get to all of them. And go for it, right? So I wanted to just acknowledge what's going on. I think it's worth noting that this webinar is not a COVID-19 webinar. That's not the point. And I personally got like 20 or 30 emails yesterday with webinars and various different things. But I want to acknowledge everybody and thank you again for being on today. I know it's an unprecedented time, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. There are a ton of distractions, and thank you for sharing your time with us. Our goal for today is to just step outside of that for a second. Maybe for an hour we can get back to some normalcy. We're going to talk specifically about DevSecOps, and it's a really important topic. And but I wanted to just acknowledge you for that. And then, I want to mention that there is a tie-in really to DevSecOps that's worth noting as well, right? That's, there are a lot of reasons, and we're going to talk about some of those today that are not related to COVID-19, but there are a lot of reasons why DevSecOps makes sense, and it's important to make sure that your applications are secure, and this is one way to really, throughout that life cycle, really address that, right? But it's also important to note, I think, that during this time of global crisis, really, the bad guys are not taking vacation, right? They are looking at this as probably an opportunity, right? Everybody's going to be slightly off, a little distracted. Maybe it's a great time to penetrate a network or do various different things. Interestingly, I saw a note this morning that a lot of the malware folks are pledging to not attack healthcare companies. So maybe there's some moral and soul out there on the dark side, but I don't know how all encompassing that is or what. But anyway, that's enough said. I want to get into the meat of the presentation, but thank you all for joining us during a time of just things like that. So what does it mean, to move to the left? Frank, you want to chime in on this at all? I mean, what does it mean to move to the left to you?
Yeah, that's it's not a very descriptive term at all. But ultimately, and we'll talk about this, the differences between DevOps and DevSecOps, but it's really the idea of incorporating security into the front of the development cycle, right up front, and integrating that into everything that DevOps is all about. So we'll certainly talk about the details, but the net of it is just to really make security part of that whole team and effort.
Yep. Yeah. Well said. And just to kind of bolt onto that, I think what I hear in the market a lot is people saying, "Hey, as a DevOps team, let's do it faster. Let's do it faster. Let's do it faster." And oh, by the way, let's make sure it's secure, right? And I view moving to the left, looking at it more like make it secure, and oh, by the way, let's make it faster. Let's do it faster as well, right? So moving to the left is really, I think, putting an emphasis on security and making it a core part of the process, right? A component of the overall process, not just an afterthought. I don't know how many times I hear enterprises give examples of, hey, the business needed an app, so they enlisted the app team and they, blah, 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 went through all the requirements, built the app, and then they're like, oh, crap, we have to get security to sign off on this, right? And so they go over to security. Everything's already done. And they say, hey, could you sign this, right? And the security guys are going, what are you talking about? I didn't even know about it. I think, moving to the left, and certainly the introduction of the concept of DevOps is really about, making sure that the things are accommodated as part of the process. So introduction and objectives. What are we going to cover today? An overview and introduction to DevOps and DevSecOps. So we'll go through that. Talk about the reasons why an organization would consider it, right? And to me, this is really fundamentally what it's all about at the end of the day, right? You got to answer that question. Why is it important to us? Why does it matter? Why should we care? And then just take a look at some of the differences, and then, ultimately explain how to do it. That's what I really want to be able to do. So first we have the developers, right? So software comes into play, and, we live in a software-defined world. There's all these different sayings and acronyms and various different things, but, software is going to eat the world. That's kind of the mentality, right? And we're seeing it all over the place. Software-defined networks, hardware as a, software as a, software-defined hardware, servers as software, as code rather, all these things, software. And so the developers are sitting there, and they were, I think, first to the race, right, Frank? That's kind of where the drive came from. First there were developers, and there was no DevOps, right?
Right, exactly. And then to really, for the developers or the applications to realize their benefit and to be deployed, certainly that's when operations came into play. So there's those dependencies on trying to support the platforms as well as deploy the application. So you have those divisions and responsibilities. But ultimately, they're, the two have to work together. There's no question about that. And that really was the essence of DevOps, was just to bring development and operations closer together and to have a defined structure and method to accomplish all those objectives.
Yep. And we talk about this a lot, regardless of what the business problem is that's trying to be solved. But the scope of operations has probably evolved over time as well, right? So first thing, software start building an app, and they're like, oh, hold on a second, we got to have a place to host it. Let's talk to the ops team, right? Let's talk to IT and see if we can spin up a server or plug a server into the racks or do whatever, the case may be. And then it was really about compliance requirements driving, change and release. You have to have change management in place. So, and somebody has to control separation responsibility and making sure that, the only, approved updates are put into production and those kind of things. So operations really expanded from that extent to now, the developers are building the code and the ops team is really managing the deployment and how it interacts with the business. Right. And that ultimately is what became DevOps, right? Do you want to elaborate on that a little, Frank? Or Yeah,
and then part of that changing role is the compliance complexity with things like containers, with serverless, and also, as you mentioned, the whole idea of infrastructure as code. So there are things that are now being automated that there still has to be some checks and balances in place to make sure that ultimately when these applications are deployed, they're done in some type of structured manner, and thus DevOps and that whole concept.
Yep, exactly. No argument. So let's do a poll. Let's Paul kick this off. Go ahead, and you should on your screens ultimately see a poll show up. So I hope hopefully it does, and then I think it's going to run for. There it is. I think it's going to run for a little bit, and then you can pick one. So, are you doing DevOps or DevSecOps today? Neither, or yes, we've moved into DevOps, but not into DevSecOps yet, or yeah, we're all in and we're doing DevSecOps. So, if you could please, respond to the survey, and then hopefully we can tally it up and see how we're collectively represented on the call today. So we'll just wait. I think about 30 seconds. I think about 30 seconds. The poll is going to run, and then we should get some results. Okay, so I see the results. I think everybody's seeing them now. So it looks like the largest percentage, about 27% of the people on the call are not doing DevOps formally or DevSecOps, but more people doing. Oh, wait a second. This is why I have glasses. I'm sorry. 60% are doing DevOps, so that's the largest percent. Clearly, that's. I'm cracking myself up here, folks. That's why you have the bar chart right next to the thing. So 60% are doing DevOps, but not DevSecOps. So 27% doing neither, and 13%, just a little over 13%, are doing all of those. So let's see what your peers had to say. If we look at Gartner does a poll every year, and some of the results from there, actually they don't talk about whether or not they're doing it, but what were the business drivers for leading to DevOps. So these are the people that are doing it, and what were the primary drivers of them doing it. And maybe it's the same as the 60% of the folks on the call. But in the Gartner poll, it was improved agility was number one. And I think what that means is basically the ability to pivot quickly to meet the demands of the market and those kind of things, right? So obviously, if you have to change your business requirements and things in your app, you have to be able to deploy those quickly. So some of the other ones, improving the release and fewer defects. So that's a big problem if you're releasing bugs into your code and those kind of things. And a mature DevOps program would help alleviate that somewhat. Yes, systematic system rollouts and various different things, reduction of weight. So any reflection on this, Frank? From a survey and or a why standpoint?
Yeah, I think that reinforces a lot of the things that everyone hears. You hear about the requirements to continue to enhance solutions and the expectation, especially with the things that are going on out there in the consumer side of the world. So specifically, as it references enterprises, there's the same type of expectation that there is the ability to increase the velocity that either features are released or actually new releases of solutions so that an organization can take advantage of those capabilities. And then, certainly when the speed is there, there's an expectation that, it's without any type of issues. So, again, those are definitely, high expectations, but that's really ultimately the promise of DevOps is to help to meet those objectives.
Yep. Very good. So another poll just based on that information, I'm curious what was for the folks that are doing DevOps, what were the drivers? What were the business reasons for doing that? If you don't mind, it would be helpful, I think, to just see if we're consistent with what Gardner said, or just think through what led to DevOps being important for your business, if you don't mind. And again, I think the poll is going to run for 30 seconds, and then we'll tally up the results and see where we land. Any guesses, Frank, as to where we're going to be from a results standpoint?
I say A, but that's just my opinion. I mean, there's all, the instant gratification, is certainly a buzzword out there. And so that's if I had a place of wager in Las Vegas, that would be my bet.
Good. Should be wrapping up soon, I think, and then we'll see where we land. I know the suspense is probably so. All of the above is the winner with 50%. So yeah, I think you're coming away. You run out of money fast if you're in Vegas, Frank. But not bad.
That's
Second's
why I
not
don't
bad,
gamble.
But that's right. But in any event, this is great. This is great information. Thank you, everybody. But the key is it's either agility, the ability to move quickly to respond to market demands, or it's all of these things. And there's no question that they all are valid business drivers. But I can't emphasize enough, and we'll talk about this a little later in the program, how important it is to understand why you're doing what you do. But that's great. Thank you everyone for responding to that. So, that said, right, all of those business benefits and business drivers for DevOps, with all of that considered, I think that, ultimately, people are looking at the operations and the processes and saying there's something missing, right? There's something awry. So what is that, I wonder? What is missing from all of that? And I don't think it's any mystery to anyone based on our topic, but the key is basically security and integrating that tightly into your processes, right? So security appears on the scene and becomes a core element of your DevOps process. And I think at the end of the day, that is the nuts and bolts of where the magic happens. And it would be hard for anyone really on the developer side or the ops side to argue about the importance of security, right? So what do you think, Frank? Are you surprised about security showing up as part of the DevOps process?
I'm not surprised, but I think, and we'll discuss it a little bit, that, the recognizing that that's a requirement and how to actually achieve that is where the complexity and the rubber hits the road. So, we'll talk about how, like we mentioned, how someone would go about achieving that goal. But it's, pretty much motherhood and apple pie that should be incorporated into the mix and the team. But how one achieves that is really the important part to see that change actually be possible.
Yep, great points. And I think if we go all the way back to what we talked about earlier, moving to the left or moving from pure DevOps to what's now being called DevSecOps, right? I think it's important to understand that it isn't magic. It's just and maybe we're doing and thinking about a lot of these things, but the order that we're thinking in them might just be convoluted in some way, and it's material because of that, right? So making security more of a priority, there's no question. I don't think anybody would argue that if there's a data breach, your externally facing applications are clearly, are clearly an area, a target, right? And so incorporating fundamental practices of security into every element of your software development lifecycle, I think, people are kind of dialed in and in tune with the fact that that's important. But still, we're creatures of habit, right? And so a lot of times it ends up being an afterthought. And that's the point I'm trying to make, right? I think DevSecOps is really just about making security less of an afterthought, more of a forethought. Let's lead with that and make sure that it's completely integrated into all our processes. So I just emphasize that and overemphasize it, because I think it's just critically important to understand that that's the material difference, right? It's not about whether you think about security, it's when you think about it and how much. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and also, Steve, just one comment on that. A lot of our emphasis has been assuming that this is a part of an enterprise, IT function or IT security and development function, but this also applies, especially in today's day and age, to any third-party providers of services that you may leverage, whether those are development resources or security resources, to align to this type of model, or in a SaaS type of scenario, understanding what the profile is of the organization that you're purchasing those services from, and whether they've adopted this type of model as well. With all the supply chain linkages and the integration of organizations, and certainly, again, tying that back to COVID-19, it's important to understand whether, the organizations that you rely on are leveraging this type of model as well from a third-party risk perspective.
Yep, that's a good point. It isn't just internal, it's internal and external. And a lot of times what we talk about at ASMGI is, being agnostic to, who fulfills the role, right? It shouldn't really matter. If you build a process that's agnostic to how the role is filled, then if they're external, they have to follow the same processes. If they're internal, they have to serve the same processes. And there are pluses and minuses probably to both models, but and many models today are integrated with internal and external resources. So that's a great point, Frank. So I flipped the slide already, so you can see how complex it's. I mean, it's not trivial, right? I mean, there are a lot of moving parts to a process like this, and it really, it really has to encompass the whole life cycle, or you end up with a broken link or a weak link in the chain, and that. So I just want to emphasize it is complex, but it shouldn't derail us, right? The complexity shouldn't create a feeling of being overwhelmed, so it prevents us from starting. It's complex, and we could spend, and maybe we will actually. It's worth noting that we'll probably do more on the topic of DevSecOps and get into the weeds more. But you could, clearly, as you see, you could spend a lot of time just talking about the individual moving parts and how they all work together. But the slide is not intended to intimidate and prevent people from starting on DevOps. The reality is it is complex, but you have to start. And I think the key to success is taking it one step at a time, right? Incremental change. That's what do you think, Frank?
Yeah, it just goes back to one of the old sayings of an ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure. I mean, it's much more costly, and the risk to the organization is much more significant if you're dealing with issues downstream from the development process, versus upstream and integrated into the actual development life cycle. So really, when you look at that graphic, it ultimately is that's really the goal, is to incorporate security into the whole life cycle when all is said and done.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Do you want to elaborate at all on any of the individual, components of this process, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, it really, starts with the, really literally the requirements gathering and the business requirements. There's early stages of the process that, if a developer is just looking at a functional aspect of a solution, they might not understand, what the security requirements are or be focusing on those. So, probably the one thing to highlight is just, how important it is to not only have security involved in the early stages of a development life cycle like this, but also to cross-train developers and to be, subject matter expertise and have some familiarity with the concepts of, threat modeling and actually understanding, what the application, the intended use of the application is or solution, and what the potential risks are of that for an organization. And if they're thinking about that at the outset of the process, it doesn't mean that security is going to be involved in every last part of it, but that's where it's important to have that cross-training and subject matter expertise, a part of that, literally everything from the start, so that the development can start off on the right foot and that there's no rework and baggage that's being dragged forward throughout the process. So that's really that left side of the model.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent. So I wanted to also, just kind of bring up, what does it look like? So the same process, right? But there's tools, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but, there's tools required at most of these steps, right? Maybe all of these steps, and integration of the tools and create an ecosystem. These are all things that we've talked about in the past, but do you want to elaborate on any of this, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, this is another example where, there's a lot of things that are done today, going back to the example of some things being ready to deploy, and maybe security is asked to do a vulnerability scan of an application or maybe even a pen test. And that's literally at the point where, it's being ready for deployment. If there's something that's been occurring way upstream in the process that has not been identified, it's very likely that that's going to delay the deployment process. And in some instances where there's continuous delivery going on, it's almost impossible to stop that process without some type of automated tools. And that's where, doing those functions upstream, as well as having the appropriate tool plugged into each stage of the life cycle is critically important, because there is no option as an organization adopts the whole DevOps culture and approach to do things manually as might have been done in the past. So there's a lot of times where static or manually driven things are done, but most of the tools that are depicted on this slide are actually automated and in line, so that these can be done, as just part of the process and execution of that continuous integration and continuous delivery life cycle.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent. So one of the comments is that some of the sound might not be that good. So I apologize. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but hopefully everybody can hear me. Frank, do you want to just chime in on that, or can you hear me okay? I can hear you clearly. So.
Yeah, I can definitely hear you fine. If someone is experiencing some audio difficulties, I would encourage you to possibly log out and log back into the webinar. That typically solves
great
that
advice.
issue.
Yep. I want to keep moving. The one thing I heard you say, I think that really resonated with me, Frank, was, find problems upstream of going live, right? And again, this is, just from the market, there's a lot of pressure on getting things into production, and quickly is, we all know about these pressures. They come from the business, they come from the market itself, our customers, and various different things. I see a lot of, when you find a problem when you're trying to release to production, it clearly equals missing a date, right? I mean, there's no time to respond, and it becomes a fire drill. It becomes all reactive. When you find things earlier, farther upstream, then a lot of times you have time to react. So I think, or respond versus instead of react, right? I would always rather be able to, or be in a position to respond instead of reacting, right? And so I think that's a key point that you make. And again, I think that in moving from DevOps to SecOps is moving security to the left. But if you took any element of even the DevOps lifecycle and moved it farther to the left, right, like identifying problems earlier in that lifecycle, the earlier the better. And I think that the whole concept of this, from a process standpoint, is designed to do those things that you need to do to flush out challenges early in the life cycle. So, great point.
And one other
this
item
slide,
on that slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, hey, Steve. One other item on that slide is that the other opportunity, and we haven't really touched upon this too much, is besides security, a lot of organizations are in regulated industries and are dealing with compliance requirements. This is also an opportunity to identify those requirements early in the life cycle and have the ability to test against those requirements as part of that toolkit or the suite of tools that are being referenced here as well, so that as development is being done, there can be checks against that, and that certainly can be applied in the continuous delivery or integration and delivery cycle as well, to validate that those requirements are being met as well.
Nice. That's a great point, Frank. And a lot of the tools, we're not going to go into the tools available for each of these components, but a lot of the tools that are available, you can generate reports against specific compliance requirements and help you, meet those compliance audits for sure. Great point, Frank. So this slide, what I was going to say, is a part of pretty much every presentation that we do, right? Because it doesn't matter what problem you're trying to solve. It's never just about the technology, and DevSecOps is no different, right? There's start with the program, define why you're doing what you're doing, what it is that you want to accomplish, what outcomes the business needs to succeed in this endeavor, and then pick the technology and define the operating model. But I think it's paramount that the programs first, pick the technology to help you achieve the outcomes that you want, and then build an operating model that supports that, whether it means that you insource or outsource or add capacity or technical expertise or various different things. But if you skip any one of these areas, then the solution will not succeed to the level certainly that it could, maybe not at all. Anything to add to that, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about this in the past on this sort of mantra, is that, especially with something like DevOps and DevSecOps, it's not just something you buy off the shelf or is shrink wrapped. It does incorporate all three of these elements, and especially as it relates to the operating model, it is an organizational change management component. In some cases there might be new roles required within the organization that's adopting this approach. Also, there's times where there might not have been the level of collaboration that you might have needed it to be able to cross those boundaries, and also cross training for different individuals. So that's really where having the program defined and then a roadmap for how to adopt it, and then dealing with all those organizational change management components is extremely important. Yep.
Yeah, no question. And the one thing that resonated with me from what you just said, and particularly as it relates to DevOps, you can't just go buy DevOps or DevSecOps, right? It could be multiple technology platforms. But your program holistically should define why are you going down this path and what is it that you hope to achieve. SLAs, the whole 9 yards, right? So, but when you get to actually implementing a solution, it's not a just open the box and plug it in, right? There could be a lot of moving parts, and certainly multiple technology solutions and those kind of things. So let's talk a little bit about how do you actually do it, right? So how do you get started? If you're not doing DevOps today or DevSecOps today, how do you actually get started? And this is, I think it applies to any business, solving any business problem. There's no question, but really understanding why. Like, why would you even go down this path, right? There has to be well-defined drivers, and I think everybody, all stakeholders involved in the team, really have to understand what they are. And the reason is, if you're likely to fail if you don't take the time to define why it is and why it's important to you as an organization. And so, as corny as that sounds, it's critically important. And I think it's number one, right? It's the first step. First, you have to define why you're going to do this, and what outcomes, right? So, and the next part, in my opinion, is just really establishing where you are. So why and defining the program outcomes that you want is going to help you figure out what your desired future state, and that might be driven by choosing a framework to follow, or it might be driven by what industry you're in and what compliance requirements you have to meet. Your future state is part of, picking what you want to be at the end of this initiative, right? And that can be driven by a whole lot of things. Current state is where you are, right? And so if you do that, if you take the time to really understand those two things, logically, then you can identify the gaps. And then you can start to propose solutions against those things. But anyway, that I think that part is critically important, and probably even more. It preempts like defining priorities and things like that, because when you start to pull the information together on the solutions, you may find that solving one piece of this puzzle, takes a long time and costs a lot of money versus another one, right? So one of your drivers might be early wins and things like that. So your roadmap, the next thing to consider really on this journey, I think, is you can't just go buy DevSecOps. You have to do it one piece at a time. And I think incremental improvements, it's a continuous improvement process. It's a process change. And I really think it has to be viewed that way. So incremental improvements, expect to be in it for the long haul, and allow yourself to do these things and let the answers show up, right? And priorities, right? Like what initiatives are you going to start with, and those kind of things. I think will become more clear as you start to go through these processes. So build a roadmap, understand that you can't do the whole thing all at once. You don't go from not having it to having it, in other words. Incremental change. And then it's probably about a 2-year initiative, to be honest. I mean, to be realistic, and maybe it takes a little bit longer, maybe it takes a little less. It really depends where you're at on that life cycle curve, on that continuum today. But the other point that I make from a change like this is start now. And here's why I think that's so important. If you start now and it's going to take you 2 years, you'll be done in 2 years. And you're never really done, right? You're always, the market and everything is evolving and moving really fast. So it is a continuous improvement. But what I mean by that is you reach the goals or the objectives outlined in your program, right? So you hit a certain maturity level or whatever it is. There's always going to be continuous improvement involved. But if it's going to take 2 years and you start now, it's going to take 2 years, right? If you wait 2 years, it's still going to take 2 years, right? So just, we can all do the math, but 2 years from now to have a mature process is way better than 4 years from now, which is way better than, not having it all. So I make that point, right? It's and we saw that slide, we saw how complex it can look, right? Don't let that prevent you from starting, because every single piece, every component of that process will help you. And if you take the time to really understand what it is you want to accomplish as you go through this, then I think it'll become clear which piece to start with, which thing to do first, what benefits you can expect, and all those things. And then you put a structured roadmap together. So what do you think, Frank? Piece of cake, right?
Yeah, that's no, I obviously agree with the approach. I just wanted to go back and emphasize on the why, how important that is, because as we have talked, this is an organizational change component. It's just not a technology thing or a security thing or anything like that. So having those stakeholders, having the executive sponsorship and buy-in, helping to by having that sponsorship, those help to deal with some of the changes that are going to be required within an organization to deal with the organizational boundaries that might exist, or in navigating, especially in large enterprises, the various, even things like budget, how are things budgeted for, where are they budgeted, reallocating of funds. I mean, all those types of factors come into play when you're looking at adopting something like this. And it starts with making sure that you have the sponsorship, you have clear agendas, you can demonstrate the business value, and then it gets a life of its own after that.
Excellent. Yep, great points. Great points. So what about challenges? What are the things that you should really, I think, be aware of that could derail your project, right? And so a lot of this I already, I spoke to and probably reiterated and emphasized in the previous slide. But when I think about, the challenges that show up when somebody embarks on this journey, they usually result from trying to skip the early process phases, right? They usually result from skipping defining why and getting stakeholders on board early and getting commitment from the top and those kind of things. Don't do that. Highly recommend against it, right? It's going to lead to challenges down the road. And, from my engineering days, I'll never forget a saying that it just was, nobody can ever afford to do it right, but they can always afford to do it over. It costs way more to do this over than it does to do it right to begin with. And so, I just don't skip it. Don't skip taking the time to understand why you're doing it. And maybe you don't have the answer, right? Maybe it's I like to use the example of, maybe you have the right reasons, but you're not saying it right. Like, for example, if you're on the development team or even if you support the development team, the reason for doing DevSecOps or DevOps in general is not that developers ought to be pushing updates directly to production, right? The reason is bigger than that. The reason is the market's changing quickly, and if you have to be able to improve the speed at which you deliver updates to production, right? The developer, getting involved in that process is a result, right? It's part of the process, but it isn't the reason why you do it, right? The reason why security should be incorporated up front isn't because, the security guys need more to do, right? It's because if you don't do it up front, you have to go all the way back to the beginning and start over if you can't pass a compliance requirement, or the cost of getting breached from an application that's going to, have sensitive data in it is way more than the cost of addressing it up front. Those are reasons, right? So, Frank, maybe you can chime in a little bit on that, but I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to really understand and make sure all of the stakeholders across the organization or the enterprise really understand why is it that we're going down this path and this journey together anyway.
Yeah, and another
what do you think?
Piece of that is, the mechanisms that are put in place to, a lot of our emphasis has been on the speed to delivery and introducing new features and functionality, but you can also look at it like if there are vulnerabilities or potential issues that are identified, or heaven forbid, some type of exploit, by having these mechanisms in place so that every part of the organization can work together more seamlessly, it does allow for the ability to respond more quickly, when some type of incident might occur. And then that also, helps if an incident is declared or some type of exploit has been identified, to kind of, get the proper resources together and ultimately to mitigate that before it causes too many issues for an organization as well.
Yep, great. And then just real quick, I'll go through a couple other things. Is like, don't come into and maybe it ties in a little bit, but don't come in starting with the answer, right? Come in with questions. And it's probably a lot of what I just talked about on the why. And then, finally, and I can't emphasize this enough, but people don't like change, right? So if you're the champion and you're driving for change, you're going to get resistance. It really highlights why it's important to do those other things and be able to explain why it's important and those kind of things. But just know that no matter what you recommend, even if it's good for the enterprise, if it's good for the organization, people don't like to change. And so there's going to be resistance along the way. I think that just highlights why it's so important to really focus on being able to explain, being able to explain why. So I'm going to keep moving here to get through. Frank and I talked about putting some use case stuff in and success stories. We have several, and I think, in choosing what to demonstrate and walk through, I think it was more important that we just talked about some of the characteristics of those use cases versus a specific use case. And we can maybe, when we get in the weeds and go into the DevSecOps stuff, we can drill down into specific cases. But I think a couple points that we wanted to make as it relates to success stories is one size does not fit all. And here's what I mean by that. There can be, depending on what your business drivers are. For example, if you're an enterprise that's has long user acceptance testing, right? A B2B type application, long user acceptance tests. Your customers are, maybe you have multiple customers in the same application or different applications, and they take some time. Fast IT is probably less important, right? If you have audit cycles or regulatory requirements that you need to meet, and maybe they become the primary business drivers versus getting to market quickly, right? The example that's always used in a fast IT world, in my opinion, is Netflix, right? If you're in a consumer-based model and getting to market quickly and updating quickly and those kind of things is critically important, like Netflix, then maybe time to market is the most important thing. But the point I want to make, and it kind of ties back to Frank's comment about not, you don't just go buy DevSecOps off the shelf, right? You have to take the time to really understand the structure of the program and those types of things. One person's drivers and needs and ultimately the program may be different than somebody else's, right, Frank?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really where it's a combination of understanding, what your business drivers are and objectives, what your threat landscape is and your risk profile as an organization. So, those are the types of things that, as we've talked, the security team is very aware of those. They can help to share and emphasize those with the development teams and the ops teams, and to make sure that ultimately everyone understands, how those all interact and drive the cadence and the overall program approach.
Yep, great points. So we got about 10 minutes left. I got a couple slides I'm going to go through real quickly, and then we'll get into Q&A. We have a bunch of questions, so I want to get through those. But I've already talked a lot about the why, and I'm not going to go back through all that stuff. So, but it's important that you understand that you need a program that defines, why you're doing what you're doing, and not so much the how and what, but really focused on the why, but how you're going to measure it and all those various different other things. So that's important. Let's get to the good stuff, right? So we're going to do a special offer, and ultimately I know how hard it can be and how complex the process can be, and so the special offer for today is a session it's consultative. We intend to deliver value as part of this session, right? But let's understand and help you get started if you're not doing it already. If you are doing it already, you can still take advantage of this. It doesn't matter where you are on that continuum of that life cycle or in that maturity. We can likely find something to talk about. And in any event, let's do that. Let's make it a consultative session for anyone that's on the call. All you got to do is reach out to Frank or I, and we're happy to do that. 1 hour is the offer. But in addition to that, if you act now, that's my attempt at humor, Frank. You're not laughing.
Like
in addition to that, I want to mention, and I'll show you a little bit on the following slide, some of what these books are. But In fact, maybe I'll just toggle to that real quick right now. Gene Kim, I don't know how many of you know who Gene Kim is, but, one of his nicknames is the father of DevOps, basically. But anyway, Gene Kim's written a couple of books. The Phoenix Project, it's a great read. If anybody out there has read it or not, I'm not sure. We made it actually a required reading at ASMGI. It's a fiction, right? It's a story about a company. They manufacture a product, and it happens to be software that's got them all hung up, and they have a manufacturing plant floor as well. But in any event, it just takes you through a bunch of different roles. You'll all find something that you can relate to in this book. It's real easy to read because it's not a how-to. It's a fiction, right? So it's a fable. But we really enjoyed reading it as a company, and I know some folks in our organization started some book club type events after the fact, and had other people that were customers and various different things kind of reading the book and talking about it and things like that. It's a really cool example. I think it's awesome, and what really resonated with me is one of the characters in the book. He's kind of eccentric, and he's on the board of this company. Whenever he wants to take the IT manager and explain something to him, he takes him up on the catwalk and looks down on the plant floor. It's a manufacturing plant floor where you see work come in one side and go out the other, and all the different stations that actually do something in order to turn that into a finished good. It's amazing how closely that relates to technology and app dev. Like there are work streams and workflows and work processes and things like that. So it's really cool, I think, just making that connection. But 2 books. Pick 2 books. So if you choose to take advantage of this, if you choose the Phoenix Project, then the DevOps, the Visible Ops Handbook is probably the right choice. It talks about a methodology for deploying DevOps. Gene Kim is one of the authors of this book, but it's a classic, well-known book as far as DevOps go. And then just kind of evolving the DevOps process. Gene Kim has come out with a new book called The Unicorn Project, a newer book, I'll say. I actually haven't read this yet, but it really is about integrating security into the DevOps lifecycle and process. So we'll be queuing this book up at ASMGI pretty soon. And then together with that is the Visible Ops Security, I'll say Visible Ops Plus Security. I should say, if I go back to the Visible Ops book, it's ITIL-based, if any of you are familiar with ITIL-based processes. So, if you're already using them in your enterprise, or if you're thinking about, how to do IT service management and DevOps, DevSecOps, and those kind of things, it's a good read. So pick 2 of these 4 and couple it with a 1-hour session, and we're happy to have a conversation with you and do those things. So that said, let's see what we have for questions. You have anything, Frank, that you want to chime in on as I start to look through these questions?
No, I know we have a couple of good questions that we want to dig into before we wrap up. Okay.
So let's dig in, Frank. I'll ask the questions, and you can start on the answer process. How's that sound? So here's a question: what do security professionals need to do to implement secure DevOps processes? You like how I didn't give you a chance to back out on that?
No.
What do security professionals? Yeah, what do security professionals need to do to implement secure DevOps processes?
Well, I think one of the first things is to reach across the aisle and establish some lines of communications. So going back to the whole idea of some type of overarching program and that holistic approach, as we refer to it, is to get to a point where there's some type of agreement that this is something an organization needs to adopt. And then, once that's confirmed, then, pretty much work through that process that we defined of, going through and, getting the executive sponsorship, beginning the process of doing the gap assessment, understanding the current state versus the future state, and basically to go through that cycle. It's also, I know you mentioned the couple of, references. I think it's also important because a lot of security professionals may not know the terminology of a developer or the development team, to begin to cross-train and school themselves on understanding some of those concepts so that they can have a beneficial and meaningful conversation with the other, with their brethren. So that's just as important as well, to acknowledge that they have to go through and educate themselves on some of those concepts.
Yep. No, that's a great point. And I think, I hear a lot from enterprises. We work pretty closely with a lot of folks in security departments in all verticals, in all industries. And I hear a lot. One of the things I hear a lot is, we get looped in too late. People come to us and say, hey, I need your signature. Can you approve this? And the work's already done, right? So I think one of the things that security people can do is, speak up and just really emphasize the importance of getting involved earlier. Sometimes it feels like, it's landing on deaf ears, but it isn't. And I think enterprises are starting to really understand the benefits of doing that. But try to really be a champion and rally for getting involved in the process earlier. And we've worked with some enterprises to build some process around whenever the business or a line of business is going to launch an application, they have to engage a security architect who kind of drives the project, but they have to engage a security architect up front, right, before anything goes into production. And that's, I think it's critical to have something like that in place. But, if you're in a large enterprise, it's really hard to get everybody on board when you implement a new process like that. So be heard and make sure you're heard and get other stakeholders involved in rallying around it, I think is important. Okay, here's another question, Frank. How do you measure the success of DevSecOps? So how do you know if you roll out a DevSecOps program, how do you know if you're succeeding or not? How do you measure it?
So that I think that's a pretty large question, or complex question, because it really goes back to defining what the goals of the program are, and then how the different, if you want to call it, successes are measured at each stage of the life cycle. So the best thing to do, and again, this is one way to demonstrate the value, is to make sure that there's defined goals or objectives at each stage of the process. So if that's the number of vulnerabilities that are identified in the development portion of a solution, those that are made to potentially testing, or those that are deployed into production, as just a few examples, it's very easy to be able to track and identify those types of metrics so that you have some type of barometer about how effective each stage of the process is, or the life cycle is, in adopting these types of capabilities, and then determining that also becomes information that can help you to define and understand the root cause of any issues if you're measuring those types of details at each stage of the cycle or life cycle.
Great. Yeah, great response. And the only thing I would say as it relates to that is it depends, right? Which is inevitably the answer to pretty much every question, right? But depending on what your business drivers are, I think that is going to dictate what is it that you should be measuring, right? So when you start to incorporate security, there are some metrics that come to mind, but it really depends on what is your why, right? And what are the primary business drivers? And so I think those things come out in the program, and part of the program should define how you measure for success anyway. So those are things that have to be addressed. One more question, Frank. We're out of time. We're top of the hour, but I'm going to go ahead here anyway. How important is culture in an organization moving towards DevSecOps? The culture of the organization, Frank, how important is that?
That is probably one of the most important items, besides having a program that and plan that you're executing against. The ability to adopt these types of changes and having a culture that is ready and open for this type of change is extremely important. And even, from the one point that you were making about security receiving something, way downstream, ultimately security wants to be an enabler of putting something into production and the business being successful. They're trying, at the point when they're trying to react to something, they're trying to protect and minimize the risk that the organization has at the point in time where something's trying to be, say, put into production. They would rather be involved way upstream to be an enabler of making sure that deadlines are met and that risk is minimized. And the only way that happens is if there's that collaborative culture for adopting change and working through and continually doing process improvement as the maturity of the organization evolves, as it adopts these types of capabilities.
Yep. Point taken. And then the only thing I'll chime in just on that real quick is I think it's critically important, the culture. Culture is we're talking about changing behaviors, and I make this statement a lot. In order to change a behavior, you first have to change thinking, and that's where I say stand up and shout if you're not being heard, and make sure you are, and get some champions on board. But speak in the terms of the business, the language of the business, because that to me is critically important. But first change thinking to change behavior, and that's where culture comes from. And I think the culture of the organization is critically important. So get stakeholders on board, and there you have it. So we're over. It's 2:02. I want to thank everybody again for joining us and hanging in there. Please reach out to Frank or myself. The slides from today, just so everybody knows, this session is being recorded. You can log back into our site or go back into our site, and I think there's a mechanism to get to the recorded version of this webinar. We will also follow up with an email and send the slides out. So anyway, net is that's available to you. We're going to do that anyway, but please reach out to Frank or myself if we can help you in any way, and if you're interested in any of these books, for sure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Bye-bye. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. Bye.